It's hard to believe that we're already over halfway through 2020, and what a year it's been so far. The past several months have been marked by disruption, loss, and pain, as our entire world plunged into the chaos of a global pandemic. More recently, a series of tragic deaths have brought the realities of racism and inequality to the foreground of our hearts and minds. Whether in response to circumstances in our own lives or the world around us, many of us are overwhelmed and grieving. As followers of Jesus, we trust that God is sovereign over even the most difficult hardships, and we hope in the promise of His love for us. But that does not mean that we do not mourn. On the contrary, God wants us to be honest with Him in every season, and to experience the freedom of bringing our questions, fears, frustrations, and sorrows to Him. This is what it means to lament. If you're like me, maybe you feel uncomfortable about the idea of questioning or raising a complaint towards God. Maybe you wonder if doing so dishonors the Lord or reveals a lack of faith. This is where the book of Psalms proves remarkably helpful. Throughout its pages, we find psalmists who are not afraid to be brutally honest as they pour out their heart along with all of its emotions before God. In fact, the book of Psalms contains more psalms of lament than any other genre. Just one example can be found in Psalm 13, where David writes, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for He has been good to me." In this passage, we find four components that are repeated throughout the Psalms of Lament. Firstly, David begins his prayer by addressing God. In other words, lament is not simply a matter of venting our sorrow or frustration out loud. Rather, when we lift up a cry of lament, we are addressing God Himself, which is itself an expression of faith. Secondly, David brings his complaint to God. Through a painful series of questions, he describes feeling forgotten by God as he wrestles with the anguish of heart and mind that comes by being oppressed by his enemies. Notice that David does not hold back. He's not afraid to be honest with God. Thirdly, David calls upon God's help. He expresses his need for God to deliver him from the enemies that are seeking to take his life. Once again, to ask for God's intervention is to express faith in His ability and willingness to help us. Finally, in a surprising turn, David expresses trust in God's love and goodness. As he pours out his heart to God in lament, David is reminded of God's faithfulness towards him, and he draws encouragement to continue trusting God. Far from lacking faith or being dishonoring to the Lord, the road to lament leads us to worship. In what ways are you weighed down by frustration or sorrow today? What might it look like for you to bring your complaint to God and be completely honest as you pour out your heart before Him? I mentioned earlier that there are more psalms of lament than any other genre in the book of Psalms. And while that's true, many of those psalms are written not from the perspective of an individual, but the entire community. In other words, as we practice lament in our own personal lives, we're also meant to do so together. With that in mind, I want to invite you to join us as we gather online tomorrow at 1:30 and 7:30 p.m. for a time of corporate prayer and lament. To join us in either of these gatherings, you can RSVP by emailing info@capstonetoronto.com with the time that you'd like to attend. Until then, know that it's the Lord who hears the cry of the broken, and when we lift up our cry of lament to Him, He is ready to respond.